Hi everyone. The focus of this screencast is going to be on some extra aspects of cultural evolution, namely art, death, and spirituality, and more specifically, what these things can tell us about um, what was going on at that time. So, what society looked like, what was happening with the development of the brain, as inferred by the artifacts that we find representative of art, death, and spirituality. But before we go on to that, I just have a few random slides that basically supplement the stuff we've already been doing. I just thought they were good slides and I didn't want to forget to put them out there at some point. So we're going to do that first. If you do go through these slides separately to the screencast, I do have lots of notes below. I will be reading from those notes as part of what I'm talking about because I kind of wrote them down as a bit of a speech. But they're there for you to kind of trawl through if you want to. So this first passage that I've added is basically just, it just really well sums up the interaction between cultural and biological evolution. So you can pause and have a read of that if you like. Basically, the fact that biology affected culture and then culture subsequently affected biology, and there was positive feedback that led to exponential growth in human evolution over time. So it's just nice to get some of these kind of examples of introductory passages kind of in your head or written down. They can be useful in exam questions. So there's that. Cultural periods. So we might be talking about some different periods in human history, and it's good to know kind of where everything falls on the timeline. So I've added in some of this information as well. So we've gone through the Paleolithic period when we were looking at tool culture, and that was really the definition or the describing kind of feature of the Paleolithic was the advancement in tools. And yeah, as we got to the Upper Paleolithic, we saw a proliferation in tool materials and uses, as well as heaps of other cultural evolutions, such as the beginnings of art and emotional satisfaction, I guess you could say, in the fossil record. So this started before the Neolithic, which is the period in which agriculture really took off, but it took the move from a nomadic to a settled lifestyle to provide the role specialization that allowed for hobbyists and people in society to explore their creative side and create sculptures and paintings and whatever it is, not necessarily just for design and aesthetics, but art had many uses. In the Upper Paleolithic, there was really rudimentary communities of caves and huts, but it really took the Neolithic development of agriculture to provide enough specialization and agrarian surplus to support artists and creators and innovators. So it's kind of within this time that art, death, and spirituality started to become more complex. So the Neolithic was the period we were discussing last lesson when we were looking at the boom of agriculture, and that was a result of permanent settlements. You can pause and read that if you want. It's kind of what I just said. And this passage here comes from Hank Green, who's one of the brothers of Crash Course. So it was part of that video that I linked into the agriculture slides. And he says the following: anatomically similar humans have been around for 250,000 years. Throughout that time, we've been expanding our toolkit from stone tools to fishing, mining, creating art, music, etc. All of this came about as a result of collective learning. Now remember, collective learning is the ability of a species to accumulate more knowledge with each passing generation than is lost by the next. So they're developing on the ideas of their ancestors, and that is technology. As long as you have a population of innovators, so that's just any potential innovator, so really a dense population of humans who keep dreaming up new ideas and remembering and developing old ones, and an opportunity for those innovators to pass their ideas on to others, you are likely to have some technological progress. And that's what it took for cultural evolution to really expand. So today we're looking at art, death, and spirituality, but more importantly, what certain artifacts can tell us about hominin cultural evolution of that period. So how you can infer from a piece of art or the remnants of, a burial ground, what that meant about the society that the creator or the deceased lived in. Let's move along. Cool. So my first question, I do want you to pause and have a think before you listen to the rest, is this. Art and spirituality began to arise in the Mousterian era. We see this in the fossil records. Why were pre-Neanderthal hominins not creating art? So there's two main reasons why pre-Neanderthal hominins were not creating art. One of them is more logistical, and the other is endocranial development kind of based. So if you could pause and have a think about that and come back. Reason number one that pre-Neanderthal hominins were not creating art is that they were simply spending all of their time surviving. They had physical needs to be met first, and that took all of their their time in the day. They were eating raw and unprocessed foods that required a lot of chewing and digestion. They were hunting, gathering, fending for themselves. This would have taken most of the day, and they were fending for themselves as individuals and maybe their dependents. Then they had to think about reproducing, meeting the rest of their physical needs. But once food acquisition became more reliable and settlements with agriculture and surplus, again, as we've said, there was more time in the day to think about developing non-priority areas, I guess. The second reason is biological, and it's simply comes down to the brain for two reasons. Number one, pre-Neanderthal hominins did not yet possess a highly developed frontal lobe, and we know from our research that the frontal lobe is responsible for logical and abstract thought, which includes planning, foresight, imagination, personality, emotions. So without the abstract thought that enables you to foresee something that doesn't yet exist, you can't create art. You can't produce something without mentally planning for it first, and that requires a developed frontal lobe. That's number one. But also art shows a move from practical to visual, so the satisfaction of emotional needs rather than just purely physical. And as art is the manifestation of emotions and satisfies emotional need, that required a large brain as well. Before emotional understanding, as a result of a large brain and an increased frontal lobe, there was no need for art. It was just not desired, and it served no purpose. Get the large developed brain was not selected for until it conferred a greater survival advantage than that posed by other energy-hungry traits, such as the robust skeleton and skull features that were required for aggressive diets. So while our diet was still really fibrous and difficult to process, the most important survival advantage was in the structure of the skull being robust and having thick, powerful muscles. As soon as we released that selection pressure on biological evolution by moving to a more soft and energy-dense diet, when we started scavenging off, already hunted carcasses by other predators and things like that, suddenly, that selection pressure on the skull and the muscles was released, allowing the body to move those reserves that they saved on producing and maintaining and developing large bones and muscles, and put it into the next best thing, which was growing the brain. And suddenly that became the most important selective advantage in human evolution at the time. The energy was best spent here, and this led to encephalization rather than production of really robust body features. So once that selection pressure shifted to the encephalization of hominins, only then was it possible for everything else to develop. And as it did, it fed back on the brain. Remember those positive feedback loops with fire and tools and things like that, and exponentially strengthened the selection pressure on the brain. That's kind of just a side note that we should be refreshing in our minds how this all works. So we started seeing art and death and spirituality in the fossil record at the very end of the Upper Paleolithic and through, what was that one in the middle, starting with M? What's it called? The Mesolithic. Into the Neolithic, where agriculture boomed, and then suddenly with role specialization we had a proliferation in these different aspects of culture. So pausing here, I want you to think of a number of purposes of art. So like I said earlier, design and aesthetic is one thing, but what else? What else do we use art for? So pause, yeah, practice thinking about these things laterally and then come back. So I've got 7 things written down here that I could think of, and they include planning for future events, so designing tools or setting out hunting strategies or things like that, even just drawing in the sand or sketching on the walls. Storytelling, so a lot of cave art was storytelling, communicating, expressing feelings, depicting warnings, so communication uses, recording of past events. Later on, mythology and more religious purposes, but more overarching, as a hobby or a time filler, art would have been a way for, a result of the increase in brain matter and development and complexity. Lastly, and probably most obviously, visual satisfaction and aesthetics, and that includes decoration like jewellery and other things, not just cave art, but all forms of art. So here are some videos that I suggest you watch. You can find them in the slide version of this. The first one's a little bit longer. It delves into cave art, and the second one is the Chauvet cave, and it's just a really famous example of cave art in Spain. It's really interesting to learn about that. So it's not essential that you know the different types of cave art and what they mean and blah, 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 blah. But you should be able to look at a piece of art and recognize what that means about the development of the creator and also what society might have looked like in those days, which is what we're about to talk about. But just purely for interest's sake, here's some examples of really prehistoric art. So we've got there hand stencils, which were an absolute classic at the beginning of the art fossil records in the Upper Paleolithic. And they would do this by placing their hand on the wall and then kind of flicking or spraying minerals around it, so to leave those prints. And then you've got a picture there of a really famous sculpture called the Venus of Willendorf, which is about 35,000 years old. And there are just there's heaps of debate around Venus, so whether the exaggerated sexual features were part of some sort of fetish or whether they were the result of a self-portrait where, the creator only had the opportunity to look down at themselves, and maybe that is the result. Or perhaps she was some goddess representing the ideal figure of a woman and childbearing and all of those things. So heaps of things. Another interesting fact is that she doesn't have a face. So some thought, without having a reflection or a mirror, maybe the creator was doing a self-portrait and didn't know what they looked like. Heaps of debate around this. It's all quite interesting. Other artifacts include fine artwork in the form of tools, decorated beads, ivory carvings of humans and animals, clay figurines, instruments, and spectacular cave paintings. The development of art is evidence of higher order thinking, so that's quite an important connection to make. Art and symbolism represent a newfound ability in this period to imagine things other than they are. And we're going to see an example of that next. Here it is. Join me in part 2 to find out more.